Former gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams is traveling to California to do some damage control over Georgia's abortion law. Jennifer Bellamy joins us. Jennifer, some people feel the trip's necessary to try to keep the film industry booming here.
Cheryl, in recent weeks, several leading Hollywood actors and producers have vowed not to work in Georgia because of the law. And a number of major production studios have said they could leave the state if the legislation goes into effect. It will be a huge blow to our state since the industry employs more than 90,000 people and brings in billions of dollars in revenue. So Stacey Abrams is flying to LA to meet with some film executives and encourage them to stay and fight the movement instead. Abrams and her allies have been rallying Hollywood leaders to donate to candidates and groups challenging the law instead of boycotting the state altogether. And just last month, Governor Kemp skipped a trip out to LA to court studio executives amid the backlash.